Futures trading involves risk and is not suitable for all investors. Content provided in this segment is meant for educational purposes and is not a solicitation to buy or sell commodities.
Hi, it's Steve and Joe from Fresh Agenda, Everag's Global Insights team. And Steve, we're back in Australia after a bit of overseas travel, a bit of a recap on the last week in Europe, some market updates, the GDT pulse, some US data, and of course, chat of the week.
So, recap on travel. Look, we went for a lap around the planet, but we'll concentrate in Europe. And look, just some of the learnings from a few days in Europe, a couple of different places we went to. Market appears to be quite steady, easing a little at the peak. There's a multitude of issues out there, Joe, but the market seems to be staying quite calm. Liquids, cream, spot milk, skim milk cons, a little weaker as you'd expect at the peak or near peak. Butter seems to be vulnerable from some of the growing producers. Poland and Ireland are pointing butter at Western Europe. The cheese market's holding together. A little lower, but it's reasonably firm.
Yeah, milk output appears to be going a little better, and hence that sort of spot price is moving down. Overall down 0.5% in March across the EU, but better trends forming in France. Germany also just picking up. France was 1.3% ahead in the last week of April, although we did hear a little whisper at the Dairy Industry Newsletter conference from a French colleague that might be a little bit overstated. So we'll see what happens with that. But just get the feeling that things are a little better, but also that bluetongue is still looming. It's very widespread in France and also Germany, which seems the most vulnerable at this point.
Yeah, that was the talk. Yeah. And some dryness coming. Soil moisture maps out of Europe at the moment are showing some incredible shades of rust and brown. When you look at this, you can see the UK is still suffering. That's that's an issue there. But Eastern Europe right through is very dry, even though you can't see it in the numbers at the moment because they've had that spring bounce, cows out early, etc. But this is a looming challenge that we have to keep an eye on. That might run into some reduced numbers later in the year for sure.
On the other hand, UK has been quite strong. So growth running about 7% at the moment. We're looking at record volumes, which, a lot of the people in the room last week were UK processors. They're certainly looking at very high volumes and having to place that product. But it's likely to hit a wall in the next couple of weeks. Pretty dry conditions, beautiful weather actually when we were there. But we might still see that year-on-year increase for the next couple of months. The market doesn't seem too worried and not really any large discount on the EU out of the UK at this stage.
The medium term, Joe, though, we did talk a lot about that in some of the forums.
Yeah, look, the theme for last week's conference was navigating a changing dairy landscape. And there was a lot of discussion about what's happening with environmental policy. We've talked before about, some of the changes in government seem to signal a bit of a softening in the stance on some of the tougher environmental regulations that were being faced, particularly in the Netherlands and Ireland. But, a lot of the corporate speakers last week were not backing off it. Arla in particular was saying it's kind of not helpful when government policy changes around like this. But for Arla, at least at this point, they're pushing ahead with their fairly significant sustainability push. We had a really interesting presentation from Sunil in France, just talking about the structural issues faced in France, aging demographics, which we're seeing everywhere, but some really interesting data about flows of milk in and out of France and what's likely to come up in the next couple of years.
The biggest issue in Northern Europe seems to be the need for consolidation. So we see Arla and DMK getting together, Friesland Campina and Milkabel, both subject to EU confirmation, of course, but it's about co-ops getting stronger, being able to capture and pass value back to farm, and they're all pushing for higher value milk solids in converting to, high protein, high fractionated products, etc. But they're also, competing for future milk. So the case going to the EU Commission to approve these deals is about improving the opportunities for companies that capture value and pass it back to farmers. And with the rising cost of on-farm production, that's a huge issue in the future. So pretty interesting dynamic there, Joe. All right. Well, in the market, let's start with butter, where we had a real run-up in GDT last week, and butter futures have lifted in response to that. Still got a pretty heavy backwardation there. I mean, it is short-term, but we get into next season where there's a bit of uncertainty about just, what the outlook in New Zealand will be. But in Europe,
Yeah, in Europe, EX butter futures have lifted firmer through the curve. That's a much flatter, I guess, backwardation there in terms of Europe. That's despite cream being weaker now, sitting below €8,000 a tonne just in the last week or so, and milk spot prices below 45 cents in Germany and the Netherlands. So it's interesting how resilient those butter futures have been, Steve.
yeah, pretty thinly traded, but it is a forward gap. You can act on those. In the US, cheese market is also firmed. Spot prices have moved higher and just doesn't feel sustainable, this. There's a slowing in the filling of new facilities and plenty of word out there about the export orders being filled, but they have to be pretty strong orders to, justify a price up near $2 a pound in the US speak. So this will be interesting to watch. There's a lot of faith that the export market is, and a recovery in demand in the domestic market is going to pull this market up. When you line up this versus Europe, though, it is an interesting, the values are converging to some extent with that firmer US expectation of value and the European market easing a little. But that gap, and we now looking at how that is represented in dollars per pound in the US. Trades in the EU still above €4,000 a tonne, which is close to about $2.05 a pound. That's the trades, the official prices, which are historic, are a little bit higher than that. The US dollar a little weaker, so there is a currency factor going in, but the advantage is narrowing to less than 15 cents a pound. History would suggest that's not a sustainable gap to lock away large volumes in contestable export markets. And particularly, there's more cheese on the way, of course, and that will widen later in the year, but that seems to be being pushed out a bit, Joe, in terms of what we're hearing back.
Yeah. Just looking at non-fat dry milk now, futures are a little bit firmer, just following the trend that we've seen out of Europe, where skim milk powder futures there have moved up a little bit. We know stocks are really tight. That's been the situation for quite some time. And while cheese demand is holding on, it means that the availability of skim milk powder is still really tight and isn't likely to improve. But still, this big gap remains in the price between the origins for skim milk powder, doesn't it?
So what do you reckon's happened in whey, Joe? There's something interesting there.
Well, we got the news last week that, or earlier this week, I don't know what day it is, but jet lag. But we did get the news that there was very much softening in the US-China trade war. So their two sides are speaking. They've agreed to back off the very high tariffs that were in place, at least for the next 90 days. We don't know a lot of detail about what the expectations are going to be in terms of what changes in 90 days. But certainly the way market is looking at this is a very positive thing. So we've just seen those futures move up, Steve. Yeah, and perhaps the expectation is that this too will just go away. The 90-day, timeline will come and go, and tariffs will just stay where they are and trade can continue.
And we're hearing a lot of reports of orders being, shipping being called and orders being readied for shipment in this lower tariff environment in the short term. So
yes, we talked a lot just up until last week about, the cancellations in shipping capacity and, reduced services through the Pacific. How long that takes to wind up again will be interesting to watch, but certainly the market thinks it's a very positive thing.
Meanwhile, on Pulse last night.
Yeah, well, we went backwards on the two milk powders on Pulse last night, back to a wide gap between the auctions and Pulse. So we've talked before about this. Often there's a big step down in the Pulse following a GDT event. But really that GDT event, when you look across the last few auctions, looks like more of the outlier, Steve. So New Zealand medium heat skim milk powder fell 3% or $90 a tonne from last week's GDT auction number 379, and it was down 3.1% on the previous Pulse. And for whole milk powder regular, that also dropped 3% or $135 a tonne on last week's GDT auction. And it was 3.2% or $140 a tonne down on the previous pulse. And again, it looks like a bit of an anomaly, the GDT last week, Steve. If you look across that curve, this looks like more of a continuation rather than, a big drop down. So did prices just get away from us a little bit last week?
Yeah, auctions and pulse results in whole milk powder, of course, are a lot closer than what we see in skim milk powder.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Some data out of the US. Commercial disappearance, or a proxy for demand, in March improved. We haven't seen this for a while. In major cheddar plus lines, so American cheese is the variety, up 1.6% in the month, but remained down around 1% in the rolling 6 months. So that's what the chart is showing there. So that's a more indicative, Joe. Month to month, there might be some, standout months, but it's always good to look at this data over a longer period.
Mm.
And of course, the monthly improvement is on pretty weak prior numbers. So it could be a little bit inflated by that effect, but it is encouraging.
Mm.
How do you wrap it up, Joe? What do you got?
Well, to bring us home this week, Steve, we're across to China, and we've got some data out of China just showing that milk production is recovering. It's still negative, but a little bit better versus the prior year. But milk processing, so the volume of milk that's being processed into fluid milk, is still well down. So manufacturing milk availability was in fact up on this data. Processors continue to report sales growth in the low single digits, so not a strong recovery that we're seeing there in China. That would mean there would be a little bit more of an import requirement than we're seeing at the moment, but they are apparently clearing stocks.
Yeah, the processors are saying their sales now in Q1 and probably what they're expecting in Q2, pretty tentatively saying they're a little bit higher, but they're also saying the inventories were stocking up. They've had that expectation for some time that they're going to pick up. And so they kept, as you can see, first half of last year, they thought they would be roaring back a bit, but that just never happened. Interesting to watch how this evolves. Okay, that's all from us. Thanks for watching. We'll be back again next week.